Hi, everyone. Today we're diving into the heart of the Vietnam War with a look at Operation Linebacker I. This was not just a regular bombing operation. This was some of the most intense aerial campaigns designed to cripple North Vietnam's war effort. Join us as we explore how this operation impacted the war and the world. If you're interested in more deep dives like this, don't forget to hit the like button and hit the subscribe button for more explosive content. Let's get started. By 1972, the Vietnam War had been raging for nearly 2 decades. The United States, which had been deeply involved in supporting South Vietnam against the Communist North, was looking for a way to end the conflict. American leaders wanted to withdraw their troops, but they also needed to make sure that South Vietnam would not collapse after they left. Peace talks were happening in Paris, but they were not going anywhere. The North Vietnamese refused to make serious compromises, believing they could win the war on the battlefield instead of at the negotiation table. Then, in March 1972, North Vietnam launched a massive invasion known as the Easter Offensive. Unlike their usual guerrilla tactics, this was a full-scale attack with tanks, artillery, and over 120,000 troops. The offensive spread across 3 major fronts, targeting Quang Tri in the north, the Central Highlands, and areas near Saigon in the south. The goal was to overwhelm the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN, and capture key territory before the U.S. could respond. At first, the attack was successful. The South Vietnamese forces were struggling, and several towns fell into North Vietnamese hands. American ground troops had already been reduced due to President Richard Nixon's Vietnamization policy, which aimed to transfer the responsibility of the war to South Vietnam. However, U.S. air power was still a major factor in the conflict, and Nixon was determined to use it. The situation in South Vietnam was becoming desperate. Nixon and his military advisors believed that the only way to stop the North's offensive was to launch a massive air campaign against North Vietnam itself. The goal was to cut off the enemy's supply lines, destroy their war industries, and force them to slow down their attacks. On May 9, 1972, Operation Linebacker I began. It was the first time since 1968 that the U.S. bombed North Vietnam on a large scale. Unlike previous bombing campaigns, this one was different. It was designed to destroy North Vietnam's ability to fight, not just pressure them into negotiations. On May 9, 1972, at the start of Operation Linebacker I, U.S. Navy aircraft carried out a mining operation in Haiphong Harbor, North Vietnam's largest port. This was a bold and strategic move designed to stop the flow of weapons, ammunition, and supplies from the Soviet Union and China. Aircraft like the A-6 Intruder and A-7 Corsair dropped magnetic sea mines into the water, making it too dangerous for enemy ships to enter or leave the harbor. This effectively cut off one of North Vietnam's most critical supply routes. With fewer supplies arriving, the North Vietnamese war effort began to suffer. By mid-1972, the effects of Operation Linebacker I were clear. North Vietnam's supply lines were crippled, and its forces struggled to continue the Easter Offensive. The destruction of key bridges, railroads, and supply depots forced the enemy to slow their attacks, giving South Vietnamese forces time to regroup and launch counterattacks. For the U.S., Operation Linebacker I marked the beginning of modern precision bombing. Instead of relying on overwhelming force, technology and strategy played a bigger role. This shift in tactics influenced future U.S. military operations, showing that well-planned air campaigns could change the course of a war. While Operation Linebacker I was highly effective, it was not without challenges. North Vietnam had one of the strongest air defense networks in the world, supplied by the Soviet Union and China. The U.S. Air Force and Navy had to constantly adapt their tactics to overcome enemy resistance and minimize aircraft losses. The biggest threats to U.S. pilots were surface-to-air missiles, SAMs. The Soviet-made SA-2 missiles were deadly against high-flying U.S. aircraft. These missiles could track targets using radar and explode near aircraft, damaging them with shrapnel. Anti-aircraft artillery, AAA. North Vietnamese forces used thousands of radar-guided and manually operated guns to fire at U.S. planes, especially at lower altitudes. MiG fighter jets. The MiG-21 and MiG-17 were fast and maneuverable, making them serious threats in dogfights. They were often directed by ground-based radar stations, which helped them ambush U.S. bombers. To reduce aircraft losses, American forces implemented several key adaptations. 1. Wild Weasel missions. Specialized F-105G. Wild Weasel aircraft were equipped with radar-seeking missiles that could detect and destroy enemy SAM sites before bombers arrived. This tactic significantly reduced the effectiveness of North Vietnam's missile defenses. 2. Electronic warfare. Aircraft such as the EB-66 destroyer and EA-6B Prowler used powerful electronic jamming systems to disrupt enemy radar signals, making it harder for SAM operators to lock onto American planes. 3. Night bombing raids. To avoid enemy defenses, some missions were carried out at night when it was harder for the North Vietnamese to track and engage U.S. bombers. 4. Higher altitude attacks. After suffering losses from anti-aircraft guns, U.S. pilots adjusted their flight patterns, conducting high-altitude bombing runs to stay out of range of enemy fire. 5. Increased use of air-to-air combat. F-4. Phantom fighter jets were deployed in large numbers to engage MiGs in dogfights, ensuring that U.S. bombers could reach their targets safely. Despite these adaptations, U.S. forces still faced significant losses. Over 130 aircraft were shot down during the campaign, and several American pilots were captured and held as prisoners of war, POWs, in places like the infamous Hanoi Hilton prison. Even with these challenges, Operation Linebacker I remained effective. The U.S. successfully disrupted North Vietnam's supply lines,
proving that air power could change the course of the fifth impact of the campaign. I had a major impact on the Vietnam War, both on the battlefield and in the larger strategic picture. By mid-1972, the North Vietnamese Easter Offensive had lost momentum, and the South Vietnamese forces, with U.S. air support, were able to regain lost ground. The combination of relentless bombing, supply line disruptions, and strategic counterattacks forced the North Vietnamese to reconsider their position. Disrupting North Vietnam's war effort. One of the biggest successes of the operation was its ability to cripple North Vietnam's logistical network. The destruction of bridges and railways slowed the movement of troops and supplies. Fuel depots and power plants weakened North Vietnam's war economy. Haiphong Harbor mining blocked essential Soviet and Chinese supplies. These attacks made it extremely difficult for the North Vietnamese to continue their large-scale offensive. Instead of attacking aggressively, they had to shift to a defensive strategy, turning the tide of the Easter Offensive. At the beginning of the Easter Offensive, South Vietnamese forces had been struggling to hold their ground. However, with the support of Operation Linebacker I, they were able to regroup and counterattack. By June 1972, the South Vietnamese, aided by U.S. air power, managed to recapture key territories, including areas in Quang Tri and the Central Highlands. The bombing raids destroyed enemy reinforcements before they could reach the front lines, giving South Vietnam a much-needed advantage. Forcing North Vietnam back to negotiations. Perhaps the most significant impact of Operation Linebacker I was its effect on peace talks. Before the campaign, North Vietnam had little interest in negotiating because they believed they could win militarily. But as their offensive stalled and their supply lines were cut off, they began to rethink their strategy. By October 1972, North Vietnamese leaders realized that they could not achieve a quick victory and agreed to resume peace negotiations in Paris. This set the stage for the eventual Paris Peace Accords in January 1973, which would lead to the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam. A shift in U.S. military strategy. Operation Linebacker I demonstrated the power of modern air warfare. It proved that strategic bombing, combined with advanced technology like laser-guided bombs, could change the course of a war. The lessons learned from this campaign would later influence future U.S. military operations, including the Gulf War and beyond. I was one of the most effective air campaigns of the Vietnam War, but it was also highly controversial. While supporters saw it as a necessary action to stop North Vietnam's aggression, critics argued that the bombing caused too much destruction and civilian suffering. Civilian casualties and destruction. Although the operation mainly targeted military and logistical sites, civilian areas were also affected. Bombing raids on bridges, railways, and fuel depots often hit nearby towns and villages. In cities like Hanoi and Haiphong, infrastructure damage led to shortages of food, medicine, and essential supplies. The U.S. tried to use precision-guided bombs, but not all strikes were accurate, leading to civilian casualties. The mining of Haiphong Harbor also sparked international criticism. Countries like the Soviet Union and China, which supplied North Vietnam, condemned the U.S. for blocking a major trade route. Even American politicians and anti-war activists questioned whether the operation was escalating the war instead of ending it. Support for the campaign. Despite the criticism, many U.S. military leaders and policymakers believed that Operation Linebacker I was a success. It stopped the Easter Offensive, gave South Vietnam time to recover, and forced North Vietnam back to the negotiating table. Without the bombing campaign, South Vietnam might have collapsed in 1972. Long-term impact on military strategy. The operation had a lasting impact on U.S. military strategy. It was one of the first large-scale uses of precision-guided munitions, showing that air power could be used in a strategic, focused way rather than just massive carpet bombing. These lessons shaped later U.S. wars, including the Gulf War in 1991, where air superiority played a decisive role. 7. I was a crucial moment in the Vietnam War. It crippled North Vietnam's supply lines, weakened their offensive, and gave South Vietnam the chance to fight back. More importantly, it forced North Vietnam to resume peace talks, setting the stage for the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. Though controversial, the operation proved that precision airstrikes could change the course of a war. The lessons learned from Linebacker I influenced future U.S. military strategies, including the Gulf War and modern air campaigns. But this wasn't the end. Operation Linebacker II was just around the corner, bringing an even more intense bombing campaign. Stay tuned for that story. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more historical content. See you in the next one.